The banker's daughter discovered her father's betrayal on what should have been the happiest morning of her life. Standing in her wedding dress while her mother wept into her hands and confessed that every last dollar of Natalie Turner's dowry had vanished into gambling debts and whiskey bottles. The year was 1883, and in Deeming, New Mexico, a woman without a dowry was a woman without prospects, especially when her intended groom was the son of the wealthiest ranch owner in Luna County, a man who had made it abundantly clear that he was marrying the banker's fortune as much as his daughter. Natalie stood frozen in the small room above her father's bank, the white lace of her dress suddenly feeling like a noose around her throat. Her mother, Eleanor, looked decades older than her 45 years as she twisted a handkerchief between trembling fingers. "How long have you known?" Natalie asked, her voice eerily calm despite the hurricane building in her chest. 6 months, her mother whispered. He kept promising he would win it back. He kept saying one more game, one more investment, one more chance. Natalie walked to the window and looked down at the dusty street below. Deeming was still a young town, barely a decade old, built where the Southern Pacific Railroad met the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card, where respectable men like her father could smile and shake hands during the day while slowly destroying their families at night. "Does Richard know?" she asked, referring to her betrothed. "His father received word this morning. Your father went to confess before the ceremony." Eleanor's voice broke. "Richard has called off the wedding." There it was, the final blow. Natalie had never loved Richard Cunningham with any particular passion, but she had accepted his proposal because it seemed like the right path, the expected path. He was handsome enough, educated, and stood to inherit thousands of acres of prime cattle land. But apparently his affection for her had been directly proportional to the size of her dowry. "Where is father now?" Natalie asked. "He locked himself in his study. He will not come out." Natalie turned from the window, carefully unpinning the veil from her dark hair. She had her mother's delicate features, but her father's steel-gray eyes and stubborn jaw. At 22 years old, she had been considered nearly too old for a first marriage, a fact that Richard's mother had mentioned more than once during their engagement. Now she was a spinster in waiting with a disgraced name and not a cent to call her own. "Help me out of this dress," she said quietly. Her mother's hands shook as she worked the endless row of tiny buttons down Natalie's back. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? In the space of one morning, Natalie's entire future had been rewritten. No respectable man would have her now. Her father had not only stolen her dowry but her reputation, her security, her carefully planned life. After changing into a simple day dress of dark blue cotton, Natalie descended the stairs to her father's study. She did not knock. The door was locked, but she knew where her mother kept the spare key. Thomas Turner sat behind his massive oak desk, a half-empty bottle of bourbon in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment she saw genuine anguish in his bloodshot eyes before he looked away. "You should not be here, Natalie." "Where should I be, father? At my wedding breakfast, opening gifts with my new husband." He flinched, but said nothing. Natalie moved closer to the desk, gripping the back of one of the leather chairs that faced it. "How much did you take?" "All of it," he said hoarsely. "Every penny your grandfather left you. The bonds, the cash, the stock certificates, all gone. And mother's inheritance." His silence was answer enough. Natalie felt something cold and hard settle in her chest where panic and grief had been moments before. "You are a coward and a thief, but you are still my father. I need to know why." Thomas Turner finally met her eyes. "I thought I could fix it." The bank was failing, Natalie. Not because of poor management, but because of the silver speculation. Half the deposits in this institution are from miners and prospectors who are about to lose everything when the market crashes. I was trying to save it, trying to save all those people from ruin. By ruining your own family, I thought I could win it back before you ever knew. I thought I could make the investments pay off. But instead you gambled it away. He did not deny it. They both knew the truth. Her father had always had a weakness for cards and dice and long-shot bets. Her mother had made excuses for him for years, but this time he had gone too far. Natalie straightened her spine. I will not stay in this house. I will not watch Mother make excuses for you anymore, and I will not live as the pitied daughter of a disgraced banker. Where will you go? Her father asked, and there was genuine fear in his voice now. You have no money, no husband, no family except us. I have myself, Natalie said. That will have to be enough. She left the study and climbed the stairs one last time to pack a small carpet bag with her most practical clothes, a few precious photographs, and her grandmother's silver hairbrush. Her mother tried to stop her at the front door, but Natalie kissed her cheek and stepped out into the harsh New Mexico sun before she could lose her nerve. Deeming sprawled before her in all its dusty, chaotic glory. The town had grown fast around the railroad junction, a jumble of wooden buildings and canvas tents that housed everyone from Chinese laborers to Mexican vaqueros to ambitious American businessmen. The streets were unpaved, and the wind constantly blew alkali dust into every crevice. It was not a gentle place, and it was not a forgiving place, especially not for a woman alone. Natalie walked down Silver Avenue toward the railroad depot, her carpetbag heavy in her hand. She had perhaps $3 in coins hidden in her reticule, money she had saved from household accounts. It was not enough to go far, and she had no destination in mind anyway. She simply knew she could not stay. Miss Turner. She turned to see Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, hurrying toward her with an expression of exaggerated concern that barely masked her eagerness for gossip. My dear, we heard about the wedding. What a dreadful situation. You must be simply devastated. I am well, Mrs. Henderson, thank you. Where are you going with that bag? Surely you are not leaving town. What will people think? I suppose they will think whatever they like. They always do. Natalie kept walking. She made it another 2 blocks before she had to stop and sit on a bench outside the Wells Fargo office. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She had no plan, no prospects, and nowhere to go. The few relatives she had lived back east and had barely spoken to her family in years. Friends from her school days had all married and moved away. She was completely, utterly alone. You look like you could use some water. Natalie looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. A man stood in front of her, holding out a canteen. He was tall and lean, dressed in the practical clothing of a working cowboy. Worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, scuffed boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. When he tilted his head, she caught sight of startling blue eyes and a weathered, honest face that put him somewhere in his mid-20s. I am fine, thank you, she said automatically. With respect, madam, you do not look fine. You look like you are about to faint from the heat, and that would be a shame because then I would have to catch you, and my horse over there gets jealous when I pay attention to pretty women. Despite everything, Natalie felt the corner of her mouth twitch. She accepted the canteen and took a small sip. The water was warm but clean. Thank you. Preston Bailey, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Most folks call me Preston, Natalie Turner. His expression shifted slightly, and she knew he had heard about her father, about the canceled wedding, about everything. In a town the size of Deeming, news traveled faster than a telegram. "If you are about to offer your condolences or your pity, please do not," she said, handing back the canteen. "I have had quite enough of both today." Preston crouched down so they were at eye level, his forearms resting on his knees. "I was not going to offer either. I was going to say that I heard Samuel Jenkins over at the restaurant is looking for a waitress. His last girl ran off to get married last week." Natalie blinked. "You think I should work as a waitress?" "I think you are sitting on a bench with a packed bag looking like you need a job and a place to stay. Sam has a room above the restaurant he rents out cheap. It is not much, but it is clean and safe." He stood up, dusting off his hands. "Of course, if you have better prospects, do not let me keep you." She stared up at him, this strange cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere with practical solutions instead of empty sympathies. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." "Because you look like someone who is trying to help herself, and those are the folks worth helping." He gestured down the street. "Sam's place is 3 doors down. Red sign. Cannot miss it. Tell him Preston sent you and he will give you a fair shake." Before Natalie could respond, Preston tipped his hat and walked back to where a handsome bay horse stood patiently tied to a hitching post. He swung into the saddle with easy grace and rode off without looking back. Natalie sat there for another minute, then picked up her bag and walked toward the restaurant with the red sign. What choice did she have? Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Samuel Jenkins turned out to be a gruff but fair-minded man in his 50s who looked her over with shrewd eyes, asked if she could carry heavy plates without dropping them, and hired her on the spot. The room upstairs was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it had a door that locked and a window that opened, and right now that felt like a palace. Natalie started work that same afternoon. The restaurant catered mostly to railroad workers, cowboys, and miners, men who were more interested in quantity than quality. She learned quickly to balance multiple plates, to deflect inappropriate comments with a cool stare, and to keep moving no matter how much her feet ached. It was brutal, exhausting work, and she fell into bed each night too tired to cry. 3 days after she started, Preston Bailey walked into the restaurant. He took a seat at the counter and ordered the beef stew and coffee. When Natalie brought his food, he looked up at her with those clear blue eyes and asked, "How are you settling in?" "Well enough," she said cautiously. "Thank you for the recommendation. Sam treating you right? He is fair." Preston nodded and turned his attention to his meal. But he came back the next day and the day after that. He always sat at the counter, always ordered something simple, and always left a generous tip. He did not press her for conversation, but when she had a moment to breathe, he would tell her small stories about his day, about the ranch where he worked, about the temperamental cattle and clever horses. It took Natalie a week to realize she looked forward to seeing him. It took 2 weeks for her to admit she was attracted to him. By the 3rd week, when he asked if she would like to go for a walk after her shift ended, she said yes without hesitation. They strolled through the dusty streets as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Preston kept a respectful distance, his hands in his pockets. "Tell me about yourself," Natalie said. "All I know is that you work on a ranch and you have opinions about stew." Preston smiled. "Not much to tell. I am from Texas originally. My parents had a small farm, but they both died of fever when I was 16. I have been working cattle ever since, moving from ranch to ranch. Ended up here about 2 years ago working for the Double Bar Ranch. You like it? The cowboy life?" "It is hard work and the pay is not much, but I like being outside. I like working with horses. And the men I ride with are good people." He glanced at her. "What about you? Did you always want to work in a restaurant?" Natalie laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No. I wanted to be a teacher, actually. I love reading, learning. But my father said it was not necessary for me to work. He said I would marry well and have a comfortable life. He was wrong about a lot of things, I take it. He was wrong about everything that mattered. They walked in silence for a while. Finally, Preston said, I heard what happened. About the dowry, the wedding, folks talk. Natalie's shoulders tensed. And what do they say? They say your father is a fool and a drunk. They say your former fiancé is a coward who only wanted your money. And they say you have more backbone than both of them combined. She stopped walking and turned to face him. You do not need to flatter me, Preston. I am not flattering you. I am telling you what I think. He met her gaze steadily. You could have stayed in that house and let your parents take care of you. You could have begged Richard to take you back. Instead, you walked out with your head high and made your own way. That takes courage. Natalie felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. You barely know me. Then let me know you better, Preston said simply. Over the following weeks, their evening walks became a ritual. Preston would appear at the restaurant as Natalie's shift ended, and they would wander through town together, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to rope and ride, about the vast loneliness of the open range and the strange beauty of desert sunrises. She told him about her childhood in Deeming, about the books she loved, about her dreams of seeing more of the world than just this dusty railroad town. He never tried to kiss her, never pushed for more than she was willing to give. His respect for her boundaries only made her want him more. One evening in late October, as they sat on the steps of the closed general store, Preston said, I need to tell you something. Natalie's heart sank. She had learned that those words never preceded good news. The Double Bar is sending a crew up north to Montana Territory to buy breeding stock. They asked me to go. It is a good opportunity, a chance to prove myself and maybe move up to foreman someday. When do you leave? She asked, proud that her voice did not shake. 2 weeks. How long will you be gone? 3 months, maybe 4. Depends on the weather and how negotiations go. Natalie stared at her hands, folded in her lap. 3 months might as well be 3 years. In that time, he would forget about her or meet someone else, or simply decide that a waitress with a disgraced family was not worth the trouble. Natalie, look at me. She raised her eyes to his. I am not telling you this because I want to end things between us. I am telling you because I am hoping you will wait for me. Because in these past weeks, you have become the best part of my day, and the thought of leaving you behind is the only thing that makes me hesitate about going. You should go, she said, even though every fiber of her being wanted to beg him to stay. It is a good opportunity. You should not pass it up for anyone, least of all me. Will you wait? He asked. It was a foolish question. They had never even kissed, had made no promises to each other. By all rights, she should wish him well and tell him she would see him when he returned, if he returned. But when she looked at Preston Bailey, with his honest eyes and gentle smile, she felt something she had not felt since that terrible morning in her wedding dress. She felt like she had a future worth imagining. Yes, she said, I will wait. Preston reached out and took her hand, the first time he had touched her beyond a polite arm to help her over rough ground. His palm was calloused from years of hard work, warm and solid. When I get back, he said quietly, I am going to court you properly. I will come to your door with flowers, take you to church socials, make sure everyone in this town knows you are spoken for. I am a waitress with no dowry and a father who is the laughingstock of Luna County, Natalie said. Are you certain that is what you want? Preston lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that it took her breath away. I do not care about dowries or what your father did. I care about you. The woman who rebuilt her life from nothing. The woman who faces every day with courage and grace. That is the woman I want. Natalie felt tears sting her eyes, but for once they were not tears of grief or shame. "You barely know me," she whispered. "Then I will spend the rest of my life getting to know you better, if you will let me." She squeezed his hand. "Come back safe, I promise." The night before Preston left, he gave her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a book, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman, and tucked inside the front cover was a photograph of him in his Sunday best, standing stiffly in front of the photographer's painted backdrop. "So you do not forget what I look like," he said with a crooked smile. "I could never forget," Natalie said, clutching the book to her chest. He left at dawn the next morning with the rest of the crew, riding north into the vast open country. Natalie stood on the board sidewalk and watched until the dust from their horses' hooves faded into the distance. The weeks that followed were the longest of her life. She threw herself into her work, taking extra shifts, saving every penny she could. Samuel noticed her dedication and gave her more responsibility, teaching her how to manage the books and order supplies. It turned out Natalie had a head for numbers and organization, skills that her father had never bothered to recognize. Letters from Preston arrived sporadically, carried by whatever cowboy or freighter happened to be heading south. They were not eloquent, these letters, but they were honest and heartfelt. He wrote about the cold as they traveled north, about the negotiations with ranchers in Montana, about the quality of the breeding stock they were acquiring. And in every letter, he wrote that he missed her, that he thought of her, that he counted the days until he could return. Natalie wrote back, filling page after page with details of her daily life, the books she was reading, the changes in Deeming. She poured her heart onto those pages in a way she had never been able to do in person, telling him about her fears and hopes and dreams. Writing to Preston felt like having a conversation with her own soul. November turned to December, and the desert nights grew cold. Natalie heard through town gossip that her father had resigned his position at the bank under pressure, and that her parents were preparing to move back east to live with her mother's sister. She felt a pang of sadness for her mother, but she could not bring herself to visit. The wounds were still too fresh. Christmas came and went. Natalie worked through the holiday, serving roast turkey to lonely men far from their own families. She tried not to think about previous Christmases, about elaborate dinners in her father's house, about gifts and laughter and security. That life was gone. She had to make peace with the life she had now. In January, a late winter storm swept through the territory, bringing snow to the desert, a rare and beautiful sight that transformed Deeming into something almost magical. Natalie stood at her window and watched the fat flakes fall, wondering if Preston was safe, if he was warm, if he was thinking of her. The crew was not expected back until February at the earliest, but in late January, a cowboy came through town with a message. There had been trouble in Montana, he said. A band of cattle thieves had tried to steal the breeding stock. There had been a confrontation. Men had been hurt. Natalie's blood turned to ice. "Preston Bailey," she said. "Is he all right?" The cowboy shrugged. "Sorry, madam, I do not know names. I just know there was shooting." She barely slept for the next week, jumping at every sound, running to the window every time she heard horses in the street. Samuel tried to comfort her, but what comfort was there? Preston could be lying dead in some frozen field in Montana, and she would not know until the crew returned, if they returned. On a cold morning in early February, Natalie was wiping down tables in the empty restaurant when the door opened. She looked up, ready to tell whoever it was that they were not open yet, and the words died in her throat. Preston stood in the doorway, his face thinner and more weathered than she remembered, his left arm in a sling. But he was alive, and he was looking at her like she was water in the desert. "Preston," she whispered. "Hello, Natalie." She dropped the rag and ran to him, stopping just short of throwing herself into his arms because of his injury. Instead, she reached up and touched his face with shaking hands, needing to feel that he was real, that he was here. "You are hurt," she said. "Just a bullet graze. Looks worse than it is." His right hand came up to cover hers. "I am all right. I am here." "I heard there was trouble, I thought." She could not finish the sentence. "I know. I am sorry. I got here as fast as I could." He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. "I kept my promise. I came back safe." Natalie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and finally let herself embrace him, careful of his injured arm. He smelled like horses and leather and cold wind, and she had never been so grateful for anything in her entire life. Samuel emerged from the kitchen, took one look at them, and said gruffly, "Take the day off, Natalie. Take tomorrow, too." She barely heard him. She was too busy crying into Preston's shirt while he held her with his good arm and murmured reassurances. When she finally calmed down enough to think clearly, she stepped back and wiped her eyes. "Tell me what happened." They sat at one of the tables, and Preston told her the whole story. The trip to Montana had gone well at first. They had found excellent breeding stock and negotiated fair prices. But on the way back, they had been ambushed by a gang of rustlers who had been following them for days. There had been a fight, a brief and brutal exchange of gunfire. Preston had taken a bullet to the arm, but he and the rest of the crew had managed to drive off the rustlers and save the cattle. "I was so scared," Natalie admitted. "When I heard there had been shooting, that men were hurt, I thought I had lost you before I ever really had you." Preston reached across the table and took her hand. "You have me, Natalie. I am not going anywhere." True to his word, Preston began courting her properly. Despite his injured arm, he showed up at her door every Sunday in his best clothes to escort her to church. He brought her wildflowers picked from the desert, small gifts he whittled from wood during the long evenings at the ranch. They attended town dances and church socials, and Preston made it clear to everyone that Natalie Turner was his girl. Not everyone approved. There were whispers that she was too good for a cowboy, or that he was foolish to tie himself to the daughter of a disgraced banker. But Preston did not care about gossip, and Natalie had learned not to let other people's opinions dictate her life. Spring came to the desert in a riot of wildflowers and mild, perfect days. Preston's arm healed, and he returned to full duties at the ranch. The breeding program he had helped establish was showing promise, and the ranch owner was pleased with his work. One evening in April, as they sat on the steps outside the restaurant watching the sunset, Preston said, "I have been saving my wages." Natalie looked at him curiously. "For what?" "For a future. I talked to Mr. Henderson at the ranch, and he said that if I continue to prove myself, he will sell me a small parcel of land on the edge of the property. Nothing fancy, maybe 50 acres, but it is good grazing land with a water source. I could start my own small herd, build a house." Natalie's heart began to beat faster. "That sounds wonderful, Preston." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I want to build that house for you, Natalie, for us. I want to marry you." She had known this was coming, had hoped for it, but hearing the words still took her breath away. "Preston, I know I do not have much to offer. I am just a cowboy with some savings and big dreams. I cannot give you the life you would have had with Richard Cunningham. No big house in town, no servants, no fancy dresses." "I do not want that life," Natalie said fiercely. "I never did. I want a life that is real, with someone who sees me for who I am, not for what I can bring to a marriage." "Then marry me," Preston said. "I do not need a dowry. I do not need anything except you." Natalie felt tears spill down her cheeks, but she was smiling. Yes, yes, I will marry you. Preston let out a whoop of joy that made her laugh, and then he was kissing her for the first time, sweet and tender and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. I should warn you, Natalie said. I have never built a house or raised cattle or done any of the things a rancher's wife should know how to do. And I should warn you, Preston replied, that I snore. I am terrible at mending clothes, and I once burned water while trying to make coffee. We will figure it out together, Natalie said, and kissed him again. They were married in May at the small church in Deeming. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding that had been planned with Richard Cunningham. Natalie wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself, and Preston wore his Sunday suit with a new string tie. Samuel Jenkins gave Natalie away, and the handful of guests were mostly cowboys from the ranch and friends from the restaurant. Her mother came, making the trip from Kansas, where she had settled with her sister. Her father did not. Natalie had sent him an invitation more out of obligation than hope, but he had written back saying he could not face her, could not face what he had done. She felt a moment of sadness as she stood at the altar, but then Preston took her hand and all she felt was joy. The minister asked if there were any objections to the marriage, and Natalie half expected someone to stand up and list all the reasons why a disgraced banker's daughter should not marry a simple cowboy. But the church remained silent except for the sound of birds singing outside the open windows. When Preston said, "I do," his voice was strong and sure. When Natalie said the same, she meant it with every fiber of her being. This was not a marriage of convenience or social advancement. This was a marriage built on respect and friendship and love. They kissed as husband and wife, and the small congregation applauded. As they walked back down the aisle together, Natalie caught her mother's eye. Eleanor was crying, but she was smiling too, and she mouthed the words, "Be happy." Natalie intended to be. The celebration afterward was held at the restaurant. Samuel had closed for the day and prepared a feast. There was roast beef and potatoes, fresh bread, pies made from dried apples, and even a small wedding cake that the baker had donated. Cowboys and townspeople mingled together, sharing stories and laughter. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing in the street as the sun set. Preston held Natalie close as they swayed to the music, his cheek pressed against her hair. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I have ever been," she answered truthfully. They spent their wedding night in Natalie's small room above the restaurant, and it was awkward and sweet and perfect. Preston was gentle, patient, and when Natalie woke the next morning curled against his chest, she felt like she had finally found where she belonged. The following weeks were a flurry of activity. Preston finalized the land purchase with Mr. Henderson, and they began planning their house. It would be small at first, just a few rooms, but it would be theirs. Preston worked on the construction in every spare moment, and Natalie helped whenever she was not working at the restaurant. She had given Samuel notice that she would be leaving once the house was finished, and he had been understanding, even offering her a part-time position if she ever needed extra income. Building a house from scratch was harder than either of them had imagined. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and the work was back-breaking. But every board they nailed, every stone they laid, was a testament to their commitment to each other and to the life they were building. The other cowboys from the ranch helped when they could, and Natalie learned that the cowboy community was tight-knit and generous. These men, who seemed rough and weathered on the surface, would show up on their days off to help raise walls or dig a well. They teased Preston mercilessly about being tied down, but Natalie could see the genuine affection in their eyes. One of these cowboys, a grizzled older man named Tom, took Natalie aside one day and said, "You got yourself a good man there. Preston is the kind who will work himself to the bone to provide for his family. But do not let him forget to rest once in a while. Cowboys have a tendency to push too hard." Natalie promised she would take care of him, and she meant it. By July, the house was finished. It was a simple structure, wood framed with a covered porch, but it had glass windows and a solid roof and a fireplace built from river stones. Natalie cried when Preston carried her over the threshold, overwhelmed by the reality that this was her home, that she had helped build it with her own hands. They furnished it slowly, buying pieces when they could afford them, or making do with hand-built furniture that Preston constructed in the evenings. Natalie sewed curtains from fabric she bought at the general store and planted a small garden near the house where she hoped to grow vegetables and herbs. Living on the ranch was different from living in town. It was quieter, more isolated. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. But Natalie found she did not mind the solitude. She loved waking up to the sound of birdsong instead of railroad whistles, loved watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, loved falling asleep in Preston's arms with nothing but the wind and the coyotes to disturb the silence. Preston's small herd of cattle grew slowly but steadily. He was a careful manager, never overextending himself, always planning for drought or hard winters. Natalie kept their books, tracking expenses and income with the same attention to detail she had learned working for Samuel. Together, they made a good team. In November, almost exactly a year after Preston had left for Montana, Natalie realized she was pregnant. She told Preston over dinner one evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He stared at her for a long moment, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Then he set it down, stood up, and pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Natalie asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy." Preston pulled back to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes. "Natalie, I am terrified and thrilled and so full of joy I can barely stand it. We are going to be parents." They held each other in the small kitchen of their small house, and Natalie felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. A year ago, she had been standing in a wedding dress, her world falling apart. Now she was married to a man she loved beyond measure, living in a house they had built together, carrying their child. Life had a strange way of working out. The pregnancy was not easy. Natalie was sick for the first few months, and the desert heat in the summer was oppressive. But Preston was attentive and worried, constantly trying to make her comfortable. He would sit up with her when she could not sleep, rub her aching back, and read to her from the books they slowly accumulated. In June of 1885, Natalie gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from town in Preston, who held her hand and wiped her forehead and looked like he was going to faint several times. But when the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, Preston cried like he had never cried before. They named him Peter, after Preston's father. He was a sturdy baby with dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and from the moment Natalie held him, she understood a depth of love she had never imagined possible. Preston was a devoted father. He would sit for hours holding Peter, talking to him in a low, gentle voice, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. When Peter cried in the night, Preston would get up to check on him, rocking him back to sleep so Natalie could rest. "I never knew I could feel this way," Preston said one night as they watched their son sleep in the cradle he had built. "Like my heart is walking around outside my body." Natalie leaned her head on his shoulder. "I know exactly what you mean." Life settled into a new rhythm. Natalie's days were filled with caring for Peter, managing the household and helping with the ranch work when she could. Preston worked long hours, but he always made time for his family. They had little money and few luxuries, but they had each other, and that was enough. When Peter was 6 months old, Natalie received word that her father had died. The news came in a letter from her mother, who wrote that Thomas Turner had succumbed to liver disease, weakened by years of drinking. He had died in Kansas, far from the town he had disgraced. Natalie felt a complicated grief. She mourned for the father he could have been, for the relationship they might have had if he had been stronger, braver, better. But she could not mourn the man he actually was. He had made his choices and she had made hers. "You want to go to Kansas?" Preston asked. "To see your mother." Natalie considered it, then shook her head. "Not yet. Someday I would like her to meet Peter, but right now I need to be here with you, building our life." Preston kissed her forehead. "Whatever you need." The years passed with surprising speed. Peter grew into a curious, energetic toddler who loved following his father around the ranch. Preston taught him to gentle horses, to mend fences, to read the sky for signs of weather. Natalie taught him letters and numbers, reading to him every night from their growing collection of books. In 1887, Natalie became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in early 1888 they welcomed a daughter. They named her Eleanor, after Natalie's mother, who had passed away peacefully in her sleep the previous winter. Eleanor, whom they called Ellie, was a sweet-tempered baby with her mother's gray eyes and her father's smile. The house, which had seemed adequate for two, felt cramped with four. Preston immediately began planning an addition, working on it during the winter months when ranch work was lighter. By Ellie's first birthday, they had 2 additional bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The ranch was prospering too. Preston had earned a reputation as a fair dealer and a skilled cattleman. His herd had grown to nearly 200 head, and he was able to hire a hand to help with the work. The young cowboy, barely 18, reminded Natalie of Preston when she had first met him. Earnest, hardworking, a little rough around the edges but good-hearted. One evening in the spring of 1889, as they sat on the porch watching Peter and Ellie play in the yard, Preston said, "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me, I mean. Living out here instead of in town?" Natalie looked at him in surprise. "Never. Why would you ask that?" "I saw you in town last week, talking to Mrs. Cunningham. I just wondered if you ever thought about what your life would have been like if you had married Richard." Natalie took his hand. "Preston Bailey, I married the right man. Richard did not want me, he wanted my dowry. When that was gone, so was he. But you looked at me when I had nothing, when I was disgraced and penniless, and you said you did not need a dowry, just me. You gave me everything that matters: love, respect, partnership, family. I would not trade this life for anything." Preston squeezed her hand, his eyes bright. "I love you, Natalie, more every day if that is possible." "It is possible," she said. "I know because I feel the same way." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together in the quiet house and talked about the future. They dreamed about expanding the ranch, about maybe buying more land, about seeing their children grow up strong and happy. They talked about eventually traveling, showing Peter and Ellie more of the world than just the New Mexico desert. "I want to take you to Texas someday," Preston said. "Show you where I grew up. It is probably all different now, but I would like you to see it." "I would like that," Natalie said. "And maybe we could go east. I would like the children to see the ocean." "The ocean," Preston said wonderingly. "That seems like another world from here." "We have time," Natalie said. "We have all the time in the world." But time, as they would learn, was both more and less than they imagined. In the summer of 1890, a drought hit the territory. The rains that usually came in July and August failed to arrive. The grass turned brown, the water sources began to dry up, and the cattle grew thin. Preston worked tirelessly, moving the herd to better grazing, hauling water, doing everything he could to keep the animals alive. Other ranchers were selling off their stock at rock-bottom prices, but Preston was determined to hold on. "If we can just make it through to next spring," he said, his face gaunt with worry and exhaustion. "If the rains come back, we will be all right." Natalie economized everywhere she could. She planted a bigger garden, preserved everything they grew, bought only the barest necessities. She took in sewing from town to bring in extra income, staying up late into the night to finish garments while Preston slept the exhausted sleep of a man pushed to his limits. Peter, now 5 years old, sensed the tension and tried to help in his childish way. He would fetch water for his mother, watch Ellie while Natalie worked, and follow his father around asking if there was anything he could do. Preston would ruffle his hair and thank him, but Natalie could see the worry in her husband's eyes. The drought broke in October with a series of violent thunderstorms that flooded the dry washes and turned the desert briefly green. The relief was palpable. Preston stood in the rain with his face turned up to the sky, laughing like a madman while Natalie and the children watched from the porch. They had made it through. They had lost some cattle and their savings were depleted, but they had survived. And survival in the harsh world of the New Mexico desert was victory enough. The 1890s brought changes to Deeming and the surrounding territory. The railroad expanded, bringing more people and more commerce. The town grew, adding new businesses and schools. The wild, lawless days of the 1880s gradually gave way to something more settled, more civilized. Preston and Natalie's ranch grew along with the town. They added more land, more cattle, and eventually Preston was able to hire 2 full-time hands to help with the work. The house expanded again, gaining a proper dining room and a study where Natalie could keep the ranch books, and Peter could do his schoolwork. Peter proved to be a natural horseman and rancher, with his father's patience and his mother's quick mind. Ellie was more interested in books and drawing, often sitting on the porch for hours with a sketch pad, capturing the desert landscape in careful pencil lines. Natalie encouraged both of them to pursue their interests, determined that her children would have opportunities she had never had. In 1893, Natalie gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named Thomas, a gesture of reconciliation with her father's memory. Preston had been hesitant about the name, but Natalie felt it was important to acknowledge that complicated legacy. "He made terrible choices," she told Preston. "But he was still my father, and in his own flawed way, I think he loved me. I want our son to carry that name and make something good of it." Thomas, called Tommy, was a sunny-natured child who seemed to find joy in everything. He adored his older siblings and followed them everywhere, much to Peter's occasional annoyance and Ellie's delight. By 1895, Preston and Natalie had been married for 10 years. On their anniversary, Preston surprised her with a trip to Santa Fe. They left the children with Preston's foreman and his wife, and took the train north to the territorial capital. Natalie had never been farther than 50 miles from Deeming in her entire life. The journey was an adventure, the landscape changing from desert to mountains to the high country around Santa Fe. The city itself was a revelation. Ancient adobe buildings, winding streets, a mix of Spanish, Mexican, and American cultures that was completely different from the Anglo-dominated railroad town where she had spent her life. Preston had saved for months to afford the trip, and he spared no expense. They stayed in a real hotel with a feather bed and hot running water. They ate in restaurants, visited museums, attended a concert. For 3 days, they were just Preston and Natalie, not parents or ranchers or business managers, just a man and a woman enjoying each other's company. On their last night in Santa Fe, as they walked through the plaza in the cool mountain evening, Preston said, "I wish I could give you this all the time. Travel, nice things, an easy life." Natalie stopped and turned to face him. "Preston, do you remember what you said to me when you proposed? You said you did not need a dowry, just me. Well, I do not need travel or nice things or an easy life. I need you. I need our children. I need our ranch and our home and the life we have built together. That is more valuable than any dowry, any amount of money. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted." Preston pulled her close and kissed her there in the plaza, not caring who might see. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured against her lips. "We both got lucky," Natalie said. "We found each other when we needed it most." They returned to the ranch refreshed and reconnected, ready to face whatever came next. And what came next was both wonderful and challenging, as life always is. Peter, now 10 years old, announced that he wanted to be a rancher like his father. Preston glowed with pride, but he also made sure his son understood the realities of the life. "It is hard work, son. Long hours, uncertain income, backbreaking labor. But if it is what you truly want, I will teach you everything I know." Ellie, at 7, declared that she wanted to be an artist. She had been taking lessons from a woman in town who had studied art back east, and her talent was evident. Natalie encouraged her, buying her proper art supplies and making sure she had time to practice her craft, even amid her household chores. Tommy, at 2, mostly wanted to chase chickens and climb things he should not climb, keeping Natalie constantly on her toes. In 1896, New Mexico Territory was hit by an economic depression. Banks failed, mines closed, and many small ranchers went under. Preston and Natalie weathered the storm better than most because they had been careful with their money, never overextending themselves, always saving for hard times. They even managed to buy additional land from a neighbor who was forced to sell at a loss. It felt uncomfortable, profiting from someone else's misfortune, but as Preston said, "If we do not buy it, someone else will. At least we will treat the land right and honor what they built." The turn of the century brought a sense of new beginnings. On the first day of January 1900, Natalie stood on the porch of their house and looked out at the land they had built their life on. Peter was 13 now, already doing a man's work on the ranch. Ellie was 10, talented and thoughtful, talking about maybe going to art school someday. Tommy was 5, full of mischief and charm. Preston came out to join her, slipping his arm around her waist. He was in his early 40s now, his face more weathered, his hair touched with gray at the temples, but to Natalie he was as handsome as the day she had met him. "A new century," Preston said. "Can you believe it?" "Sometimes I still cannot believe any of this," Natalie admitted. "When I think about where I was 17 years ago, standing in that wedding dress, watching my life fall apart, I never could have imagined this. This life, this family, this happiness." "Do you ever hear anything about Richard Cunningham?" Preston asked. Natalie shook her head. "Last I heard, he married some girl from Arizona, a railroad heiress, I think. I hope he is happy, or at least content." "You are more generous than I am," Preston said with a laugh. "I hope his wife drives him absolutely crazy." Natalie elbowed him gently. "That is not very Christian of you." "Maybe not, but it is honest." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the Cook's Range in the distance. The new century stretched out before them, full of possibilities and uncertainties. "What do you want for the future?" Natalie asked. "Now that we are entering this brave new world?" Preston considered the question. I want to see our children grown and happy. I want to watch Peter take over the ranch someday, if that is what he wants. I want to see Ellie become the artist she is meant to be. I want to see Tommy figure out what makes him happy and pursue it with everything he has. And I want to grow old with you, sitting on this porch, watching the seasons change." "That sounds perfect," Natalie said softly, "and for the most part, that is exactly what happened." Life was not always easy, but it was good. The ranch continued to prosper. Peter grew into a capable young man who loved the land as much as his father did. Ellie eventually did go to art school in San Francisco, funded by years of careful saving, and returned with a teaching certificate and a portfolio of stunning landscape paintings. Tommy discovered a love of horses and became one of the best trainers in the territory. In 1905, Peter married a rancher's daughter from Silver City, a practical, kind young woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the far edge of the ranch property, and within 2 years, Natalie and Preston became grandparents to twin boys. "Twins," Preston said, holding both infants with practiced ease. "Lord help us all." Natalie laughed, watching her son and daughter-in-law with their new babies. "You survived 3 children. Peter will survive 2. "I had you," Preston pointed out. "That made all the difference." As the years passed, Preston gradually turned over more of the daily ranch operations to Peter, though he never stopped working entirely. He could not imagine a life without cattle and horses and the endless sky. But he also enjoyed the slower pace, the chance to spend more time with Natalie, to travel a bit, to be present for his grandchildren in a way that his own parents had never had the chance to be. Ellie married a teacher from Deeming in 1908, a quiet, scholarly man who adored her talent and supported her art without reservation. They lived in town, where Ellie opened a small studio and taught painting to anyone who wanted to learn. She never had children, but she poured her maternal instincts into her students, becoming a beloved figure in the community. Tommy eventually started his own horse training business, earning a reputation throughout the territory for his skill and patience with difficult animals. He married late, at 30, to a widow with 2 young daughters whom he adopted and loved as his own. Through it all, Preston and Natalie remained the center of their growing family. Their house became the gathering place for holidays and celebrations, filled with children and grandchildren and, eventually, great-grandchildren. The small house they had built with their own hands had been expanded and renovated multiple times, but the original structure remained, a testament to where it had all begun. In 1915, on a mild spring evening, Preston and Natalie sat on the porch as they had done countless times over the decades. Preston was 62 now, his hair completely gray, his body showing the wear of a lifetime of hard physical labor. Natalie was 54, her dark hair streaked with silver laugh lines framing her eyes. "I have been thinking," Preston said, reaching over to take her hand. "That is always dangerous," Natalie teased. He smiled. "I have been thinking about how lucky I am, how blessed. There are men who live their whole lives and never find what we have." "What do we have?" Natalie asked, though she knew the answer. "Everything," Preston said simply. "Love, family, purpose, a life well lived. When I think about that day in town when I found you sitting on that bench, looking lost and heartbroken, I thank God I was brave enough to offer you water. And I thank God I was brave enough to accept it," Natalie said. "You know, my father once told me that my value was in my dowry and what I could bring to a marriage, but you taught me that my value was in myself. You looked at me when I had nothing and saw everything you wanted." "You were everything I wanted," Preston corrected. "You still are." Natalie leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in peaceful silence, watching the sun set over the land they loved. Their children were grown and happy. Their grandchildren were healthy and thriving. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, a legacy of hard work and love. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before you left for Montana?" Natalie asked. "I said a lot of things that night. You said, 'I do not care about dowries or what your father did. I care about you.' That was the moment I knew I loved you. Not just liked you or was attracted to you, but truly loved you." Preston kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made, not caring about dowries. Turned out I got the greatest treasure in the territory anyway." They sat together as the stars came out, one by one, pinpricks of light in the vast New Mexico sky. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family. Peter and Sarah had come for dinner with their children, and the house was full of laughter and conversation. This was their legacy. Not wealth or status or social position, but love. A family built on respect and partnership and unwavering commitment. A life that had started with loss and betrayal, but had grown into something beautiful and lasting. Years later, when Natalie was in her 70s and Preston had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, she would sit on that same porch and remember. She would remember the young woman who had stood in a wedding dress and watched her life fall apart. She would remember the kind cowboy who had offered her water and, eventually, his whole heart. She would remember building a house, raising children, weathering droughts and depressions and all the challenges that life brought. And she would smile because she knew that she had been blessed beyond measure. Her father had stolen her dowry, but Preston had given her something far more valuable, a life of love, purpose, and belonging. He had not needed a dowry. He had only needed her, and she had only needed him. That was the greatest gift of all. Natalie lived to see her grandchildren grown and married, her great-grandchildren starting families of their own. She watched the territory become a state in 1912, saw automobiles replace horses on the streets of Deeming, saw the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable when she was young. But through all the changes, one thing remained constant: the love story she and Preston had written together. It lived on in their children, who had seen what a true partnership looked like. It lived on in their grandchildren, who grew up hearing stories about how Grandma Natalie had rebuilt her life from nothing, and how Grandpa Preston had loved her without needing anything but her heart. When Natalie finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 81, surrounded by 3 generations of family, her last thought was of Preston. She imagined him waiting for her somewhere beyond, ready to take her hand and walk with her into whatever came next. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations. The original house, where Preston and Natalie had started their life together, was preserved as a reminder of where it all began. Great-great-grandchildren would play in its rooms, running through the halls where their ancestors had lived and loved. And always, the story was told: how a young woman lost everything and found her true self, how a cowboy fell in love with a woman who had nothing, how they built an empire of love from the ashes of betrayal and loss. It was a story about courage and resilience, about looking beyond wealth and status to see the true value of a person, about building a life on foundation of mutual respect and deep, abiding love. It was a story that began with Natalie standing in a wedding dress, her dowry stolen by her own father, her future uncertain. And it ended with Preston saying the words that changed everything: "I do not need a dowry, just you." Those words had been more than a proposal. They had been a promise, a vow, a declaration that love was enough. And for Preston and Natalie, for their children and grandchildren and all who came after, it had been more than enough. It had been everything.